But today we have Professor Gabriel Finkelstein, and he teaches European history at the University of Colorado at Denver. His biography of Émile du Bois-Reymond received an honorable mention for History of Science, Medicine, and Technology at the 2013 Prose Awards. And Professor Finkelstein actually last time visited us and did a presentation on that book. It was shortlisted for the 2014 John Pickstone Prize, which is Britain's most prestigious award for the best scholarly book in the history of science. And the book was named by the American Association for the Advancement of Science as one of the best books of 2014. Some of you may remember that presentation. It was fascinating. And we're grateful that he accepted our invitation to come back. And he's going to talk today about Darwin and Neuroscience, the medical context of natural selection in 19th century Germany. Welcome, Professor Gabriel Finkelstein.
Thank you, Tess. Appreciate the invitation. Thank you, everyone else from the community here for coming to hear my talk. This talk is basically an adaptation of a paper I wrote for a friend who was editing a volume on 19th century German Darwinism. And that paper is adapted from my book. This story was originally presented about 10 years ago at a conference. So this isn't the first time that I've discussed this material, but the story is relatively unknown, even in the community professionals in my field, so I wanted to share it with you. About 40 minutes long, and then we can have a little time for discussion. No slides, unfortunately. I'm going to read my talk. So now most historians attribute the warm reception of the English naturalist Charles Darwin to three factors: native tradition of evolutionary thought, popular writings of naturalists like Ernst Haeckel, and a large audience of free thinkers eager to identify progress with nature. The early adoption of the principle of natural selection by the neurophysiologist Émile du Bois-Reymond, his dates are 1818 to 1896, complicates this narrative. His example refutes the contention that Darwin owed his success in Germany to romantic ideas of teleology, form, and development. Instead, natural selection aligned with the Lucretian reasoning that du Bois-Reymond used in his studies of neurophysiology, perspective that favored mechanical explanations over the invocation of immaterial spirits, final causes, and supernatural interventions. And this talk describes du Bois-Reymond's immediate advocacy of Darwin's theory, arguing that the principle of natural selection was a mode of explanation congenial to his mechanical outlook. It also identifies de reum natura, that is, on the nature of things, by the Roman poet Titus Lucretius Carus. Basically, his dates are 1st century BC, as the primary source of du Bois-Reymond's scientific philosophy. Both points, the fact that a neuroscientist was the first German convert to Darwin and the influence of Lucretius on his conversion, represent significant revisions to the historiography of the reception of Darwin's theory. So let me first turn to my subject. On the 25th of January, 1883, the professor of physiology at the University of Berlin, Émile du Bois-Reymond, read a short obituary appended to a speech delivered in celebration of the silver wedding anniversary of the Prussian crown prince and princess. Addressing members of the Academy of Science, Ministry of Education, and the royal family, du Bois-Reymond summed up the significance of his English counterpart. Quote, "Darwin seems to me to be the Copernicus of the organic world. This is the astronomer's theory had displaced the Earth from its position at the center of the cosmos, he argued, The biologist theory had displaced man from his position at the center of nature. Both upheavals had marked revolutions in science. It might have been expected, Bois-Reymond's speech didn't sit well with the conservative press. Kreuzzeitung denounced it as treasonous. The Reichsbote noted that it equated man to an ape. Germania attacked it for promulgating a bestial doctrine. And the Königliche Volkszeitung would have recommended prison, but noted that, quote, professors like Monsieur Bois-Reymond, who refer to women in their lectures as human mother animals, should not be crowned with martyrdom. Similar invective poured in from readers. Pastors reproached Bois-Reymond for materialism. Catholics deemed him worse than nihilists. Anti-Semites threatened him with the law of the jungle. Critics sent him a photo with, "Look at this ape," scribbled on the back. Brother monkeys invited him to the zoo. Wags had him proclaiming his fraternity with wildlife. Most condescendingly, an aristocrat implored him to drop the term human mother animals, since abusing women had never been the German way. The furor then spread to the Prussian parliament, where it provoked 2 days of angry debate. August Reichensperger, the Catholic Center Party deputy for Cologne, regarded Bois-Reymond's beliefs as little better than those of, quote, redskins in the wilds of America. Ludwig Windhorst, the leader of the Center Party, was amazed that the rector had been permitted to lecture on Darwin without express reprobation, and went on to dismiss the theory of evolution as incomplete and unproven. Not only had Bois-Reymond denied the Mosaic theory of creation, which undergirded the teachings of the Church, but he'd also violated the Prussian Constitution, which was founded on Christian doctrine. Most outrage was Adolf Stucker, the leader of the anti-Semitic Christian Socialist Party. Stucker was appalled that Bois-Reymond used a public ceremony to promulgate crass materialism. Professors were supposed to edify students, not shock them with terms like human mother animal. As far as he was concerned, men with revolutionary tendencies shouldn't be appointed to universities and showered with honors. In the past, free thinkers had kept quiet. Now, with the salto mortale, these self-indulgent celebrities flout the teachings and experience of millennia, threatening to turn German culture into a sea tossed by storms, today high, tomorrow low, until mankind ultimately founders on the cliffs of folly. More than a little hypocritically, Stucker exhorted his followers to stone the windows of Bois-Reymond's Institute of Physiology. This vignette is telling. Germany had long been recognized as the nation most amenable to Darwin's theory, in part due to talented writers like Ernst Haeckel, whose popularization sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and in large part due to an audience of educated workers eager to adopt any doctrine that naturalized progress. What is less well known of this spread of ideas is the role played by Bois-Reymond. Prussian neuroscientists had long been reckoned too mechanistic in perspective, too experimental in practice, and too conservative in politics to have had any interest in evolution. In fact, he was the first German professor to adopt Darwin's theory, as well as the first professor to teach it to students at a university. In homage to Theodosius Dobzhansky, we might even go so far as to say that nothing in German Darwinism makes sense except in the light of Bois-Reymond. Now, Émile Bois-Reymond was an unlikely convert, born the same year as Karl Marx, Emily Bronte, von Turgenev, and Frederick Douglass. He belonged to a generation marked by disappointment. His political hopes failed with the Revolution of 1848, and his professional hopes were only realized a decade later. By the time he was appointed professor in 1858, most of the steam had bled out of his research, and in compensation, he directed his energies to lecturing and writing. The appearance of Darwin's theory encouraged a change in his attitude. Bois-Reymond had heard of the origin of species from his friend Henry Bence-Jones. Some of you may remember Bence-Jones from Bence-Jones proteins. Okay. And though he was unable to obtain a first edition in November 1859, picked up a copy of the second printing the following spring. Darwin's book has not told among our scientific men, he informed Bence-Jones on the 4th of April, 1860. They consider it a slight aberration of intellect, a heterodoxy painful to look at in an otherwise deserving man. By contrast, Bois-Reymond found his argument entirely convincing. In July, he sent Darwin his memorial to Johannes Müller, that was his advisor. In November, he voiced his strong approbation for Darwin's theory to the historian Georg Heinrich Pertz, a man he knew to be married to Charles Lyell's sister. The next summer, he helped Darwin attain an honorary degree from the University of Breslau, and he may well have introduced the origin to Vicky, the Prussian crown princess. Lyell found her very much au fait with the book and other novelties in science like the prehistoric pile dwellings that Bois-Reymond had seen in Neuchâtel. Within a year, Bois-Reymond had drawn up a general survey course to his medical students highlighting two recent ideas, conservation of energy and Darwin's theory. These findings of contemporary science served as his response to Alexander von Humboldt's Cosmos, a 4-volume sketch of the physical description of the universe that was the best-selling work of the day. Up to then, Bois-Reymond typically lectured on physiology, but Humboldt's example led him to the conclusion that popularizers of science, as he put it, persist in the public mind as memorial stones of human progress long after the waves of oblivion have surged over the originators of the soundest research. His assessment was correct. Over the 3 decades that he taught his survey at the University of Berlin, something close to 25,000 auditors heard him explain Darwin's theory. His lectures, by the way, they were the most popular at the university. They filled the largest hall, about 400 or 500 people, standing room only. So if you add in the lectures that he delivered to audiences in the Rhineland and the Ruhr, the speeches that he held on official occasions, and the reprints of his public addresses, Bois-Reymond's impact as a Darwinian was considerable. Zoologist Ernst Haeckel offers an interesting comparison. Like Bois-Reymond, he studied under Johannes Müller. Like Bois-Reymond, he was immediately struck by Darwin's theory, and like Bois-Reymond, he offered a course in evolution once he was named professor at the University of Jena. However, he mistakenly assumed that no one in Berlin had grasped the importance of the origin, and when he was invited to present Darwin's theory to the Congress of German Scientists and Physicians in 1863, he used the occasion to argue less for the principle of natural selection than for the threefold parallel between embryological, systematic, and paleontological development. This biogenetic law, as Haeckel termed his morphological analogy, not only provided the strongest proof of the truth of evolutionary theory, but offered science a tool for reconstructing the history of the lineage from the sequence of changes apparent in the embryo. Haeckel's emphasis on typological order reappeared in 2 subsequent books, The General Morphology of the Organism, 1866, and his most important scientific treatise, The Natural History of Creation, 1868, his first popular publication. In contrast to Darwin's reticence in specifying genealogies of species, Haeckel made so bold as to print stem trees in both works, vertebrates in the General Morphology and races of men in the Natural History of Creation. Bois-Reymond regarded Haeckel as having pushed things too far. In an address to the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1876, he argued that morphological laws were more akin to legal maxims than mathematical derivations. Evidence from embryology was disparate, and evidence from paleontology was inconclusive. The clues to the order of species suggested by Darwin's theory did not support conjectures about the heritage of man. As Bois-Reymond quipped, Haeckel's family trees of human origins were worth about as much to naturalists, quote, as the pedigrees of Homeric heroes to historians. If I want to read a work of fiction, he added, I can find something better than a history of creation. Bois-Reymond saw nothing remarkable in Haeckel's focus on common ancestry. Earlier naturalists like Goethe, Lamarck, and Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire had long been aware of similarities in organic structure. Anyone with even a moderate familiarity with paleontology, he noted on another occasion in 1882, will immediately be led to the idea that life has evolved sequentially to greater perfection. Were he to deny this, you would have to conclude that life either arose out of nothing or appeared in its current stage of development. Neither of these alternatives were a serious possibility. Whoever remains a strict actualist, whoever believes in a molecule of carbon or iron is today what it was eons ago, whoever wishes to imagine the natural world as intelligible, told his students, will declare the latter claim to be absurd. There have been as few heroic ages of the earth as there have been of humanity. In his eyes, the real novelty in Darwin's theory lay in the principle of natural selection. This regular process entailed the variation of species, the inheritance of characters, the multiplication of offspring, the competition for resources, and the survival of the fittest. In other words, a mechanism, a biological adaptation that avoided the extremes of random accident and divine purpose. By providing this third alternative, that of establishing blind necessity in the place of final causes, Bois-Reymond judged Darwin's theory to have constituted one of the greatest advances ever made in the world of thought. More than one contemporary agreed. Philosopher Otto Kaspari likened the struggle between chance and teleology to a black ghost haunting all philosophical consideration of empirical research. Similarly, Bois-Reymond long believed that even basic concepts of force and matter were nothing other than, quote, a more recondite product of the irresistible tendency to personification, a habit of animism that was antithetical to science. Final causes in nature are incompatible with its intelligibility, he explained in 1876. Hence, if there is any way of banishing teleology from nature, the scientist has to take it. The way is found in the theory of natural selection. And holding fast to this theory, we may feel like a man clinging to a plank that only barely keeps him afloat. When the choice lies between a plank and going under, the advantage is decidedly on the side of the plank. Bois-Reymond's allusion to Lucretius was clear. The origin of species may have been a shipwreck, but it was better than going under. Clearly, Bois-Reymond and Haeckel differed in their interpretations of Darwinism. But why did relations between the two men turn so acrimonious? Both biologists rejected vital forces as agents of adaptation. Both judged Christianity to be a retrograde institution. Both deemed anthropomorphism to be the cardinal error of science. Moreover, Haeckel initially approved of Bois-Reymond, praising the exceptional industry and brilliant gifts of exposition displayed in his memorial to Johannes Müller. It wasn't until 1872, when Bois-Reymond delivered the keynote address to the Congress of German Scientists and Physicians on the limits of natural knowledge, that Haeckel broke with his colleague. Responding to Bois-Reymond's assertion that consciousness was beyond the ken of science, Haeckel accused him of denying the theory of evolution. To his mind, Bois-Reymond's failure to acknowledge the historical development of consciousness placed him in league with the evil horde of the Catholic Church. Quote, this seemingly humble but actually presumptuous ignorabimus, he remarked in the Latin conclusion to Bois-Reymond's lecture, is the ignoratus of the infallible Vatican and of the Black International which it heads. Such duplicity was typical of a scholar who knew all too well how to conceal the weakness of his argument and evidence and the shallowness of his thought with striking images and flowery metaphors, and by all the phraseology of rhetoric in which the eloquent French spirit is so superior to our awkward German one. Bois-Reymond's ignorance of natural history had nonetheless blinded him to the fact that consciousness was an aggregate function of the ganglia. That mattered little, Haeckel announced. The best counter to the miserable ignorabibus was the prospect of the mind's continuing evolution. No one could foretell what powers it might acquire and what problems it might solve. Bois-Reymond did not wait long to respond. 3 years later, in an address on the 7 riddles of the universe, he characterized Haeckel as a fanatic who should have been known better than to have denounced him as belonging to the black band of Jesuit priests. Such a comparison demonstrated once again how near radicalism, Bois-Reymond's shorthand for the recent expulsion of the Society of Jesus, is to despotism. Haeckel was equally mistaken in criticizing him for ignoring the evolution of the human mind. This may have been the case, Bois-Reymond allowed, but then Haeckel had failed to realize that our species had not altered since the time of Homer, that the world would freeze long before the advent of any super beings, and that however much our brains might develop, they could never hope to fathom the intrinsic subjectivity of consciousness. Anyone has sinned against evolution, Bois-Reymond pronounced. It is the prophet of Jena. Haeckel retaliated by protesting Bois-Reymond's intolerance of disagreement, indicting his ignorance of morphology, disparaging his expressions of doubt, and decrying his position as the all-powerful secretary and dictator of the Berlin Academy of Sciences. Haeckel continued to attack his revival for the remainder of his career, an unfortunate tendency that was not helped by Bois-Reymond's riposte, such as the accusation that Haeckel played to the crowd, or that he believed that he had solved the riddle of creation, or that his theory of unconscious memories signaled a return to the hereditary German proclivity to unbridled speculation, or that he ministered to the idols of confusion and needed to be thrown out of the temples of science. It speaks volumes for the relationship between the two Darwinists that less than 3 years after Bois-Reymond died, Haeckel published his most popular work, The Riddles of the Universe, a clear reference to Bois-Reymond's address. Now, some of this quarrel can be attributed to genuine disagreement over what constituted proper scientific research. Haeckel trained as a marine zoologist, and whether we continue his program of evolutionary morphology, a divergence from, an adjunct to, or a fulfillment of Darwinian theory, it is clear that Bois-Reymond had taken little interest in embryology since he abandoned investigations of the topic in 1840. Similarly, Haeckel had little patience for the experiments that had made Bois-Reymond's name in neurophysiology, just as he had had little patience for the philosophers that Bois-Reymond quoted in his discussion of Darwin. Even though both of their views of evolution were Lucretian, Haeckel didn't discover the Roman poet until 1882, whereas Bois-Reymond first read him in 1838. More broadly, Haeckel espoused what Mario de Gregorio has called a quintessentially conservative view of knowledge, that of a system of the universe, a scientific fundamentalism eager to displace Christian theology. Haeckel imagined nature as a kind of ancien régime, complete with family trees, tables of ranks, and signs of nobility. In consequence, he stood behind the vanguard of his more modern colleagues. When he wasn't taken as seriously, he grew defensive, as he did with the strictures of Wilhelm His and Rudolf Virchow. Bois-Reymond shared none of Haeckel's insecurity. Contemporaries recognized him as the foremost naturalist of Europe, the last of the encyclopedists, and one of the greatest scientists Germany ever produced. Such confidence helped him to acknowledge brilliance in others, whether in science, as in his admiration of Hermann Helmholtz, or in literature, as in his love of Edgar Allan Poe, or in art, as in his praise of Julia Margaret Cameron, whose career he advanced, by the way. He was a judge at Cameron's first show of photographs in Berlin and helped launch her career. Bois-Reymond understood that natural selection destroyed both purpose and progress. The best that could be said of any species was that it had reached a state of what he called adaptive equilibrium. Faced with the ultimate mystery of creation, he had learned to be modest. Research has on the scientific mind an edifying influence like that of life on character, he wrote in 1876. And let me quote him. Being corrected at every step by nature and constantly reminded of the uncertainty of his judgments and the fallaciousness of his firmest conclusions, being sooner or later fallibly punished for every rash opinion, for every act of blind trust in appearances, being richly rewarded for diligence and fidelity at times other than those he might have hoped. Such is a discipline which accustoms the experimental scientist to be chary about brilliant conquests, to approach the truth by gradual steps, to test it as impartially as though his aim were to prove the contrary, and finally, when he has arrived at a number of mutually contradictory facts held together by a tissue of obscure relations, the whole pointing toward various possibilities among which only experience can choose to keep present to his mind the best of these that he knows. Bois-Reymond suggested that the small warfare of the laboratory acted on thought the way that natural selection acted on species. Best ideas might win out, but their truth was always provisional. This was a far cry from Haeckel's claim to have solved the riddles of the universe. Which brings me back to Bois-Reymond's memorial to Darwin. Haeckel accused his rival of plagiarizing his comparison of Darwin to Copernicus, citing a talk he had given to a private circle of friends in 1865. 2 years earlier, Haeckel compared Darwin to Newton. However, the parallel had also appeared in an obituary of Darwin that Bois-Reymond read in the Times. More likely, they both picked up the idea from either Thomas Henry Huxley, who had equated Darwin to Copernicus in an article on the origin for the Westminster Review, or Oskar Schmidt, who had suggested the pairing in a lecture in Vienna. That is where the similarity ended. Haeckel portrayed Darwin as a fulfillment of the promise of Lamarck, a messiah, so to speak, grounded the religion of descent in the theory of selection. Bois-Reymond recounted a more profane history. Darwin's contrast with the Copernicus reflected less on the men than on their times. We now accept what we once cast away. While the Holy Inquisition persecuted the followers of Copernicus with fire and sword, Bois-Reymond wrote in conclusion to his obituary, Charles Darwin lies buried in Westminster Abbey among his peers, Newton and Faraday. Science had vanished superstition. Easy to see why Bois-Reymond's presentation enraged the Catholic press. The Roman Church in Germany was far from surrendering its claims to authority, especially after surviving the Kulturkampf of anti-clerical legislation of the 1870s. Bois-Reymond's intimation that Catholic efforts had been in vain must have struck its followers as particularly insensitive, given that recent elections had returned the greatest gains to left liberals keen on renewing the fight. Catholics had come to expect broadsides against their faith from popular writers. They didn't expect the broadsides to come from a scientist of the stature of Bois-Reymond. But there's an even deeper reason for the reaction of the faithful. In 1883, Germany possessed a large socialist party that believed in the inevitable triumph of a classless society. Bois-Reymond's reading of Darwin supported this outlook, describing a world with no fixed order and no natural ranks, only the remorseless prospect of continued strife. To Catholics and conservatives, this was tantamount to anarchy. Truly, our society cannot persist on the basis of this materialism, wrote the Koblenzer Volkszeitung in response to Bois-Reymond's obituary. To what depths of barbarism and bestiality has science sunk? A man who propounds such radical theories is more dangerous than the worst socialist and revolutionary. In the same way, the Frankfurter Volkszeitung wondered whether Darwin's theory wouldn't throw the world into utter disarray and whether professors who promulgated it weren't worse than, quote, 100 socialists, nihilists, and communists. Bois-Reymond's obituary, the newspaper argued, was little better than a warrant for the Red International to arm itself with, quote, bombs, petards, and gasoline. Bois-Reymond wasn't just opposed to the church. Darwin wasn't just opposed to the church. Darwin was opposed to civilization. Let me conclude. Ernst Haeckel remains the best known spokesman for Darwin in Germany. His Natural History of Creation went through 12 editions, and The Riddles of the Universe sold more than 650,000 copies, making it the most successful work of popular science in German history. As a result, Haeckel's interpretation of Darwin has generally been taken as paradigmatic. On this view, Germans regarded evolution as a theory of development with natural selection, environmental influence, genetic inheritance, all producing increasing complexity in organic forms. Haeckel's Darwin is progressive. Émile de Bois-Reymond complicates this story. As a physiologist, he considered natural history to be beside the point. What mattered was natural selection. He arrived at this understanding early in his youth when a close friend recommended that he read Lucretius. The Rerum Natura contained the main elements of his popular course of university lectures: cosmos of matter and motion, an expression of the conservation of energy, a view of life constrained by evolution, and an expectation that the universe would end. It was hardly surprising then that the Roman poet prepared him for the origin of species. Anyone versed in the classics might have felt the same. As Matthew Arnold observed in 1871, "I cannot understand why you scientific people make such a fuss about Darwin, why it's all in Lucretius." Like the Roman poet, the only explanations Bois-Reymond deemed scientific were those that dispensed with the superstition of final causes. This was the main advantage offered by Darwin's theory. It accounted for the apparently teleological arrangement of nature without having to rely on either divine intervention or innate purpose. The principle of natural selection operated mechanically, setting natural history on the same basis as physiology. In short, Darwin had done for species what Bois-Reymond had done for nerves. Julian Huxley called the 6 decades between Darwin's death and the modern evolutionary synthesis of the 1930s the eclipse of Darwinism. Huxley's phrase indicates a turn in biology away from seeing natural selection as the main agent of evolutionary change. In this regard, the modern synthesis of the 30s and 40s may not have constituted a reformation of the field of natural history, but it did mark a renaissance in the reputation of Darwin. And yet, I cannot help but wonder at the permanent decline in fortune of Darwin's first German champion. Bois-Reymond trained thousands of medical students. Did he really have no effect on later generations? Did 20th century biologists really rediscover Bois-Reymond's characterization of natural selection as a mechanical, aimless process? Perhaps the links are missing. I suspect we simply haven't found them. Thank you.
So we do have time for questions and comments. I'd like to start with just a comment of delight and appreciation for these flowery metaphors. I'm thinking of them as the anti-tweets. Things like crashing tides, black ghost, men clinging to planks, the idols of confusion in the temple of science, and small warfare in the laboratory.
They wrote marvelously. They wrote better than I could ever hope to write, and it's humbling and somewhat dispiriting to read scholars who have skill in language that just I'll never obtain. So I tried to do honor to them by telling their story and quoting them because, yeah, I can't write like that. They just wrote wonderfully. And Du Bois-Reymond's English, by the way, I didn't translate it. The stuff that he wrote to Henry Bence-Jones, that was his style. Yeah. Writes better than most of my students in his third foreign language. His first language was German and second French and his third English. He also spoke Italian. Sure.
So what changed in the 20s and 30s that made Darwin get resurrected? Was it a presence of data or religious reformation, or what? Post World War I, what really happened?
That's a wonderful story of the evolutionary synthesis or the modern synthesis, which I consider as great a scientific achievement in the 20th century as the working out of quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity. It's less known among most people than other theories that have been heralded in the 20th century. And effectively, it's the confluence of a whole variety of scientific disciplines and their findings that added planks or elements to the structure of natural selection. Darwin had a couple problems with his theory that he was unable to basically answer other than through speculation. One was mechanisms of inheritance that had been worked out with genetics, and the other was sources of variation that were worked out by studies of Mendelian inheritance and, well, you know this stuff, group selection and genetic drift. There were a variety of not only types of scientists, paleontologists and systematists and field biologists and mathematicians who came together, but this synthesis was truly international. It occurred in every country that I can think of that had any science to speak of, with the exception of France. Quite interesting. The French, as far as I know, still don't completely accept Darwinian theory because it's not causal as they see it. But in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, in Russia, in many countries, there were contributions to the modern synthesis. Hi, sure.
In relation to the last comment, do you think the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee in 1927 had any effect on the nation's view of evolution?
Well, it certainly did in the popular mind, and you can see that, I've seen Inherit the Wind, I'm sure you have. The intelligent design controversy, I think it was in Dover, Maryland. That it continues to animate popular culture. I don't know if it had any effect on the science itself. But what's interesting is that there's always been this disjunction, so to speak, between what the scientists are doing and then the popular reception. What I'm trying to suggest in this talk is that that's new, that's 20th century. In the 19th century, the scientists and the popular reception were more intimate. They were more closely connected. Du Bois-Reymond was the professor of physiology, in other words, leading biologist at the leading German university, which was at that point the leading university in the world. So when he gave his popular lectures on Darwin, it came with all the authority of that's quite different from someone like Richard Dawkins, like popularizers now, who, but there's only one exception, I think, is Stephen Jay Gould, right, who is the kind of person who combines both scientific research and popularizer in one person. But, you know, I thought that I would call Du Bois-Reymond the Stephen Jay Gould of his day, but I guess that's, maybe Stephen Jay Gould is the Du Bois-Reymond. Sure.
Yeah,
Du Bois-Reymond, one of his innovations was to posit the theory that, well, it's Hebbel's theory of neural Darwinism. He suggested that the nervous system and the brain responded to use by changing its organization. So I know he said that. He didn't study it much. He couldn't show it. There were histologists and embryologists who were working at development, but as far as I know, their knowledge of neural development was fairly primitive. In Du Bois-Reymond's day, it was mainly functional localization. That's what. And the scientists who emphasize a kind of innate plan of development could only do so by making analogies that Haeckel made, which are now completely untenable. Haeckel's phylogenetic law basically says the organism recapitulates the phylogenetic stages of historical development, which analogy of growth form necessity there. So Haeckel used Darwinian theory as like a trick to get into uncovering the paleontological past. You would just like look at an embryo and go, oh, earlier stage evolutionarily, but tell me, as far as I know, that's utter nonsense. I mean, there's only an apparent similarity between ontogeny, which is the life cycle of the organism, phylogeny, which is the so-called species order. Modern Darwinian theory doesn't recognize an order of species. Everything is all relatively adapted. So there's no order to species. And this parallel between the development of the organism and the development of species, which also parallels the fossil record with more primitive fossils prevalent in earlier stages of Earth history and then more complex fossils prevalent at later stages of Earth history, my mind is nothing other than pre-modern society written into nature. In each case, the fossil record, for example, that would stand for civilization. Species order would stand for social class, and individual development, ontogeny, would stand for maturation. So there's like a sociologist who claimed that this is how culture worked, that basically as individuals grow up, they move from savages to civilized, mature. But this is all nonsense. That's a kind of roundabout non-answer to you.
That it's a word, these ideas of progress.
Sure.
That are, as you say, non.
Well, it's only apparent. It's only seemingly apparent. There's no way to show that. Other than just looking at form. But as you know, formal analogies is the worst kind of scientific reason. This looks like this. Sorry to the literature professors, but that's poetry.
I mean, it seems.
Right. But the idea that they're necessarily recapitulating their phylogenetic history is just based on apparent similarities in the embryo that aren't necessary. Yeah.
The thing that's called discriminative is that doesn't mean question positive and negative valence.
Right. Sure. But there's other ways to look at, there's other measures of progress, which are not sequential, but that of an organism differentiating itself. That's what von Baeus thought, right? As organisms develop ontogenetically, they become increasingly more unlike branching view as opposed to. But all of these analogies are just basically, oh, it looks like this, not it must be this way. There's no theory to explain how memory is transferred from the species to. That's like some kind of cosmic unconscious memory.
But there is theory, and that was Haeckel's issue, in that he saw, he took the biology and added to it sociology in order to move Darwin's theory from species to races.
Sure, but I would
and
argue
the entrance of acquired characteristics rather than inherited characteristics, which they did not understand at the time that Darwin and the dialogue that you're talking about, because Mendel's papers were not rediscovered until I think 1900.
right, but
So
I would
well
argue
after that.
Haeckel didn't add sociology. Haeckel's theory was sociology.
top of governance.
Darwin's theory is also sociological. There's a good article by Robert Young that says Darwin is social. There's no distinction between social Darwinism and Darwinism. See organisms as necessarily in competition is to take, as Engels said, it's clearly Victorian capitalism, necessarily competing with each other. If you look at the reception of Darwin, for example, in Russia at the time, they don't see competition between individuals or species. They just see survival as the main issue because, Siberia looks a lot different from Kent. And why should it be competition that is the main driver? Why not altruism? Darwin had a lot of trouble with altruism. Couldn't explain social organisms like bees or wasps, and he couldn't explain people. People cooperate. So he sort of, in the second book, the big one, Descent of Man, came up with a different view how to explain civilization. He said, well, basically group selection. People cooperate, then they have a competitive advantage over another tribe, and that drives progress. But all of these are necessarily social metaphors. Necessarily. And ask the animals, are you competing?
If I may, the title of your talk is Darwin and Neuroscience. And I'm a neuroscientist who teaches brain evolution, neurology residents, and first-year graduate students in neuroscience. And you mentioned the Inherit the Wind, and I used part of the dialogue. This is not working.
Apparently, slime molds think, apparently.
Actually, it doesn't.
Yeah, this is the medical context of natural selection in 19th century Germany. I had to put Darwin in the title because you couldn't get anyone in. Darwin and Neuroscience. So I'm saying a neuroscientist was the first Darwinist. That's my point. Someone with a mechanical, mechanistic view of biology, a biological reductionist, was the first German scientist to convert to Darwinian thought, because Darwin did for the world at the organismic level that he had done for the world at the microscopic or laboratory level. Darwin provided a principle or means to explain apparent order that didn't involve anything divine. No, this guy that I worked on was one of the founders of modern neuroscience because he discovered the action potential. The first person to turn neuroscience into, more or less, into something you would recognize in a modern lab. But he addressed this issue of, he did address the issue that you raised of when does something think? And he thought that, actually he reduced it to simple sensation. Thought that the transition from insensate matter to sensible organisms was an eternal conundrum. No one would ever be able to explain. That's what he was, in the popular mind, he was best understood for, was talk on the limits of science. He said, we'll never understand the fundamental nature of matter, never understand consciousness or that lies beyond scientific understanding. And no one has been able to show that he's wrong. That's what Haeckel said. Not much. And the philosophers of mind are still repeating Du Bois-Reymond's arguments. And Du Bois-Reymond argued that even a perfect species, perfectly evolved species, he called it the Laplacian being. That is, a consciousness that knew the positions and momenta of every atom in the universe. That even, that's how he defined perfect scientific knowledge. But complete knowledge of the natural world. That even that mind couldn't understand consciousness because there would be nothing in the knowledge of all the matter and energy in the universe on the one hand and your subjective experiences on the other. What he called an unbridgeable gap. So at the term, the hard problem or the gap, that comes from Du Bois-Reymond. So he said, doesn't matter how far we evolve, we'll never get it. By the way, that, for those interested in art and literature, that concept of the perfect mind, the Laplacian spirit, later taken up by a Polish science fiction writer by the name of Stanisław Lem, book Solaris, which was turned into a movie by Russian director Tarkovsky, who many film buffs think is the greatest director. He made by George Clooney. Du Bois-Reymond's speech informed some modern. But the arguments of the philosophers of mind, they drive me crazy because they never go back and look at what people did in the 19th century, and they effectively are just replicating these debates, like Haeckel's position and Bois-Reymond's position, without adding much new other than philosophical jargon. I'm being recorded. Some of the clerics liked Bois-Reymond's idea of limitations of scientific knowledge. They thought that by saying there were some questions science could never possibly answer, that kind of opened the door for natural intervention. But Bois-Reymond rained on their parade and said, no. Just because we're agnostic or we don't know those things doesn't mean God in the natural world. And so he managed to annoy everybody.